Well, shall we get started?
I think so.
Yes.
Elif, I think you're starting the ceremony.
All right. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Ankara director of American Research Institute in Turkey. We have a pretty huge crowd today. For those of us stuck on the west coast of the US, good morning. And those of you who are spread out around the world, good evening, or the rest of the time of the day. Thank you all for joining us. I want to start out introducing Tuğba Ekmekçi Littlefield from the Institute of Nautical Archaeology at Bodrum, and Matthew Harpster from Koç University's Mustafa Koç Maritime Archaeology Center, and thank them for coming up with this idea of hosting a co-sponsored lecture series. And I'm also especially grateful for Debbie Carlson for being our first lecturer. So I will pass the word on to Tuğba, who will introduce Debbie Carlson. And afterwards, Matthew Harpster will be leading the question and answer. In the meantime, if you have questions, please use the chat box and we will get through the questions at the end of the lecture. And of course, if you have questions at the end, you can also raise your hand. And I will ask you to please turn off your sound so that there's no interference during the lecture. So thank you all for coming, and here's Tuğba.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, or good morning, everyone. And Dr. Debbie Carlson is the INA president for the last 10 years. Also, she is the associate professor in nautical archaeology program at Texas A&M University. She has undergraduate and graduate degrees in classical archaeology, and she earned her PhD in University of Texas in Austin. And she had terrestrial fieldwork experiences in Italy and Greece between 92 and 95. She excavated 2 shipwrecks off the coast of Turkey between 1999 and 2011. One is 5th century BC Tektaş shipwreck. The other one is 1st century BC Kızılburnu shipwreck. She took a graduate seminar in classical seafaring with George Bass in 1997 and wrote a research paper about the ancient helmsman that he graded with A+. After the seminar, George Bass invited her as his assistant director at Tektaş, and she recently dusted off the paper and published it in the TINA Maritime Archaeology Journal as a tribute to George Bass, who passed away last March. Now I look forward to listen her talk about Tektaş shipwreck.
Wow, thank you, Tuğbacığım. Thanks to all of you for being here. I want to, of course, thank Matthew and Kudar and Elif and Erit. To those of you in the States, I'll say good morning and welcome. And to those of you in Turkey and places in a different time zone, iyi akşamlar and hoş geldiniz. Okay, so I hope everyone is viewing the first slide, the title slide of today's talk. We're going to be talking about the 5th century BC shipwreck at Tektaş, Burnu. And before I begin, I just really owe a huge debt of gratitude to this man, George Bass, the founder of INA and the director of the excavation that I'll be talking about today. Obviously, this project would not have happened without him, but also I think many aspects of my career would not have happened without George Bass. So I want to say thank you to him and dedicate this lecture to him and his many achievements. All right, so our topic today takes us to the Eastern Mediterranean, the Aegean, actually, and specifically to the western coast of Turkey, which you see here in the area boxed in red. That's the Karaburun Peninsula and the Greek island of Chios, just slightly to the west. If we close in on that image, we can see the location of Tektaş Burnu here, which was part, really, the site is part of, in antiquity, what was known as Ionia, the 12 cities of Ionia, which was easternmost Greece. And you see many of those cities there identified in red. Some of the ones that we'll be talking about today, of course, include Erythrae and to the west, Chios, but many others you will recognize, for example, ancient Smyrna or modern day Izmir, and Foça or ancient Phocaia. So let me just take us for a moment to the actual site of Tektaş, Burnu, which you must know in Turkish means Cape of the Lone Rock. That is, in fact, the Lone Rock, Tektaş Adası, which gives its name to the cape. And in this image, we're actually looking south. So in the very distance there, you can see the Greek island of Samos. If I back up, of course, you can see Samos down here to the south. And Chios lay to the west of our wreck site, our excavation site. And we had many, many beautiful sunsets and the opportunity to look westward toward Chios. But the landscape at Tektaş Burnu was remarkable and rugged, a difficult place to work. It was totally uninhabited. You can see the rocky outcrops here, these razor sharp rocks. So I want you to remember this slide when we review the ship's surviving hull remains later in the lecture, because of course what you see on land tends to also continue under the water. But despite the rugged conditions, we were about 45 minutes from the local nearest fishing village. We had, of course, no electricity, no running water, all of that we had to provide ourselves. But owing to the tremendous engineering skills of INA staff members Robin Piercy and Murat Tilev, we lived in relative luxury for about 3 months over each of 3 summers between 1999 and 2001. I say relative luxury, but I tell you, when the graduate students came around the corner and saw our camp for the first time, there was always a sort of shallow gasp, because I think they realized that they were spending the next 3 months in these living conditions. And yet, by the end of each summer, we were a close-knit family. I will say that the diving platform, which you see obviously closest to the water, only that really needed to be rebuilt every year because it was regularly washed away by the southerly lodos winds and waves that would just break it up and carry it away. So at the beginning of every summer, we rebuilt portions of the camp, including always the dive platform. And this building up here, I'll just point out, was what we called the White House. That was the only vaguely waterproof building in camp, and it was where we kept all of our cameras and computers and electronic equipment. But underwater, just off of the dive platform, were you to dive down into the water from the platform, about 40 meters below the surface, between 38 and 43 meters below, this is what you'd see. This was a mound of about 50 or 60 amphoras nestled in a sandy sort of gully between 2 large outcrops of rock. And this is what the wreck looked like when it was discovered in 1996 during an INA shipwreck survey directed by my colleague and INA Vice President Cemal Pulak. Several of the amphoras that were raised from the wreck in 1996 were studied by Mark Lawal, I think the next year, and it was Mark Lawal who provided a working date for this wreck in the 3rd quarter of the 5th century BC. And as we will see, that date has only been refined ever so slightly. So here you see the shipwreck during the initial excavation. We, in fact, used a string grid to orient divers to the wreck site. But for absolute provenience, we relied on what was at the time fairly new technology in shipwreck archaeology, and that was photogrammetry using digital cameras. I realize that's probably hard for some of you to believe that digital photography was in its infancy just about 20 years ago, but it's the truth. And watching that revolution for archaeology has been a really impressive process. So you can see here how we used these labels. We affixed labels to each of the amphora mouths, and then we had datum points or datum towers set up around the wreck site. And by using cameras with calibrated lenses, we were able to capture hundreds of photographs on a given dive, and then process those photographs to determine the XYZ coordinates of the 3 dots on those amphora labels. We actually began this process in 1999 using film cameras, and then developing the film and scanning the film and processing the images. But by the 2nd and 3rd seasons, we were in fact using digital cameras in underwater housings. So we've come a long way in just a couple of decades. Obviously, the signature of this shipwreck is the mound of amphoras, transport amphoras, as is the case for so many ancient shipwrecks in the Mediterranean. And so I'd like to just walk us through the different amphora types that come from this cargo. Arguably, the 2 most important or most diagnostic amphoras from the Tektaş Burnu ship came from the island of Chios. They are Chian C2 on the left and C3 types, C3 on the right. And these, thankfully, can be fairly narrowly dated. They are distinguished by that bulge on the neck, and the shape and location of that bulge. Basically, it moves upward toward the mouth over time. And so the amphora on the left can be dated between 450 and 440 BC. And the amphora on the right, the C3, is slightly later, which gives us really the latest working date for this shipwreck of between 440 and 425 BC. We do not have many, if any, artifacts in the cargo that seem to post-date 425 BC. So the discovery of these 2 amphoras from Chios, hugely important for the dating of this shipwreck. We also found in the course of excavation 10 amphoras from Mendi in northern Greece, and ancient sources describe the fact that Mendian amphoras were often associated with wine, and the wine of northern Greece had particularly appealing qualities. Curiously, however, 9 of the 10 Mendian amphoras from Tektaş Burnu were actually filled with pine tar. So you see one of them there at the left, still stuffed with pine tar, which was, even after 2 millennia, still very odoriferous. It still smelled very strongly of pine. The 10th Mendian amphora was actually filled with bones, beef bones, mostly ribs, as was another larger example of an amphora I'm about to show you. So this was particularly interesting, the presence of beef, presumably salted beef meat stored inside amphoras. And it's a project I've been working on with zoo archaeologist David Rees, who is studying the bones from Tektaş Burnu. It's interesting that there are, in fact, other examples of the maritime transport of meat in antiquity. But this wreck, I believe, is the earliest and the only example of beef being transported in amphoras. And of course, many shipwrecks have animal bones, but it's not necessarily always clear that those bones were being transported or whether they're intrusive. So that's interesting because of what we know about how the ancients had access to beef, which traditionally was most likely a result of festivals and religious festivals and the sacrifice of cows in a festival setting. Now we read about actually beef as a commodity in fragments like this one from the comic poet Hermippus, writing in the 5th century BC. And Hermippus talks about salt and beef ribs being transported from Thessaly, although there are some who suspect that the text is corrupted and that Thessaly may in fact refer to Italy. But at any rate, there is some textual evidence to support the transport or trade in beef meat as a maritime commodity. So we have 2 Chian amphoras and then 10 of these amphoras from northern Greece or Mendi. The rest of the cargo was comprised of this type of amphora, 196 examples of an amphora type that was, at the time that the excavation began, could only really be identified as the pseudo-Samian type. And pseudo-Samian is a name given to this shape of jar because it seems to mimic or echo amphoras produced on the island of Samos. So it's not clearly an attribution, it's just sort of a geographical guess based on the shape of the amphora, which absolutely fits within the southern Aegean, but obviously pseudo-Samian is not specific, not all that specific. So one of the things that we were very excited to be able to contribute to amphora studies and amphora scholarship is a clear identification for this type of amphora, and I'll get to that in a minute. I should also just point out that in the image on the left, that does not show how the amphoras actually appeared on the wreck, but this was rather a temporary underwater depot or storage area. So we were taking amphoras off of the wreck and then one by one raising them to the surface as sea conditions permitted. So in that image, they're actually being inventoried by Ina archaeologist Sheila Matthews. And we surmise that these pseudo-Samian amphoras, almost 200 of them on board this ship, were transporting wine because we see that the insides of the jars were lined with pitch or pine tar. And inside that lining, it's possible on occasion to see grape seeds, as we do here. Exterior of these jars on occasion were stamped, and these stamps, of course, are connected to production. They were applied before the jars were fired. So these are pre-firing marks, probably applied when the jars were still leather hard. And we have 20 or so examples of amphoras with just simple circles, either on the neck or at the base of one handle. And we can't really do much with those amphora stamps. They don't tell us a whole lot. We also have about a dozen jars that have this leaf motif, sort of like an ivy leaf in a lozenge shape, always on the neck, centered on the neck of these jars. And again, it's an interesting icon. We're such an icon-rich, we live in such an icon-rich time period, but again, not too much we can necessarily infer from icon or iconographic stamps like this. And then in the course of cleaning and studying the 196 pseudo-Samian amphoras from Tektaş, Burnu, we identified one example of the stamp you see here, which is the Greek letters E-R-Y, epsilon, rho, upsilon. And this is an ethnic basically being a civic abbreviation for the Ionian city of Erythrae. And you can see that same ethnic used there on a Hellenistic bronze coin. Obviously, that is not from our shipwreck. I just included it here to show you an example of where the E-R-Y ethnic appears. So this was really exciting and gave us our first clear indication that we could attribute at least some of the pseudo-Samian amphoras around the Mediterranean to a production site at Erythrae, which fit very nicely actually within the morphological style of jars in the Southern Aegean. Now, people have asked me in the past, why one? You have 196 amphoras. Why is only one of them stamped? What is the significance of that? And I'm hard pressed to give a definitive answer to that question. On the one hand, though, I think it's indicative, it reflects the fact that amphora stamps at this time period in the 5th century BC were pretty unusual. Only a very small percentage of amphoras were in fact stamped. Whether or not we could say that this is a reflection of some economic or even legal process like taxation, I'm more skeptical about that. I do think, though, from an archaeological perspective, it's a powerful reminder about the importance of excavating shipwrecks to completion whenever possible. If we had sampled this wreck and only explored 1 or 2 grid squares, the likelihood that we would have raised this one jar with the erythrae ethnic stamped on it is fairly remote. Now, in the 5th century BC, we do have other examples of what I like to call civic types of amphora stamps. So we have the ERY stamp there from the Tektaş Burnu shipwreck, and I am unaware of any direct parallels for that specific stamp. If anyone has seen one, please let me know. But you may have seen elsewhere stamps from the island of Chios, which feature a sphinx standing in front of the distinctive Chian amphora type with that bulging neck or bulbous neck, and then a little bundle of grape leaves is often shown on the coin that's up here. So we can identify the amphora stamp as related to Chian coin issues or numismatics, although it's not necessarily a clear one-to-one. They're not identical, but clearly Chios and also in northern Greece, the city of Mendi, were using these sort of civic types, these civic emblems as stamps on their amphoras in the 5th century BC. Amphora stamping, of course, explodes in the Hellenistic period and becomes much more common. But amphora stamps in the 5th century BC were relatively infrequent. Now, looking at the image on the right, the map where you see the proximity of erythrae, of course, in modern day Turkey, and Chios in modern day Greece. In antiquity, this was all easternmost Greece. This was all Ionia. And if we take a step back, we can get a better sense, I think, of the historical context of this part of the Aegean, the historical context of Chios and erythrae in the 5th century BC. This map, I think, shows very well that Ionia, the westernmost strip, basically, of Turkey, was functionally the easternmost Athenian empire. That's what this map is showing us. And of course, the Persian Empire looming very large, even further to the east. But this map also shows that the vast majority of Greek cities in the Aegean were paying tribute. Okay, that's what the key down here tells us, that they were paying tribute to Athens in support of the Delian League, the League of Athens and her allies. We'll come back to the amount of tribute that was being paid here in a moment. But what is really challenging for most archaeologists who are interested in the condition of Ionia in the classical period is that there is very little archaeological evidence for habitation at many of the sites in Ionia. Most of the stratigraphy that is the result of excavation shows a void, an absence of material and presumably people in the 5th century BC. And we can document this really up and down the westernmost coast of Turkey. So this void in the archaeological record has been hard to reconcile with the amounts of tribute that some of these cities are recorded as having paid to Athens in the 5th century BC. And Erythrae is no different. There is very little in the archaeological record from the 5th century BC. And the same is true at nearby sites like Clazomenae, where you only really have some isolated evidence on Corinthina Island. But even as far north as Troy, there are holes in the archaeological record in the 5th century BC. One interesting piece of evidence that we do have from Erythrae, and I won't spend a lot of time on this because I'm not a epigraphist, but this is the so-called Erythrae decree. This was discovered in Athens. It's believed to date to the middle of the 5th century BC, although there is some debate about the date. And essentially, this decree explains the democratic institutions that were being installed at Erythrae. This was sort of formulaic text. This happened fairly regularly as Greek cities revolted or left the Delian League. So then Athens would arrive on site and they would institute various political offices and political architecture to reinstall a democracy within a city that was in revolt. So this decree seems to suggest that the city of Erythrae had revolted from the Delian League probably in the late 450s when this decree was issued and a democracy was reinstalled. Really most important or most, one of the sources we rely on the most are the Athenian tribute quota lists. And these are not without problems and pitfalls, but essentially these inscriptions record the amount of tribute being paid by various cities around the Aegean to Athens in the 5th century BC. And if we look at Erythrae specifically, it's rather interesting that by the late 450s, Erythrae does not appear in the tribute quota lists. Instead, as we see here in 453, the city of Boutheia, which was a neighboring city of Erythrae, appears on the list. And then perhaps after Erythrae had been brought back into the Delian League and the democracy reinstalled, you can see how the Athenian tribute quota lists and documents or inscriptions like the Erythrae decree become very closely connected. After Erythrae comes back to the League, she paid tribute in the amount of 9 talents as in partnership, basically, that's a scintille, in partnership with these other smaller neighboring cities, 5 of them. Then in the 440s, Erythrae is listed alone. And then in the late 430s, Erythrae actually pays almost as the representative of these neighboring cities. So what this seems to suggest is that the nature of Erythrae's relationship with her neighbors on the Karaburun Peninsula was changing. And it might be possible to connect those changes with the assertion of leadership represented by the single ERY stamp on the Pseudo-Samian or Erythraean amphora from Tektaş, Burnu. So if we can say that beginning in the 430s, Erythrae assumed some sort of leadership or representational role, it is curious to me that it's precisely that time that we see the lone ERY civic stamp on the Tektaş Burnu ship. Okay, so in addition to the amphora cargo, we have examples of ceramics from the wreck. And these look to be mostly local Ionian East Greek ceramics. I will tell you that Dr. Bass often spoke of finding so much red figure pottery that we would one day be reading about the Tektaş painter. But in fact, we found no red figured pottery on this ship, which was almost honestly more interesting than I think if we had found a lot of red figured pottery. So we have various examples of East Greek ceramics, most of them in multiples of 12 or 13. Here you see oil lamps. Excuse me. We also have cantharoi or drinking cups, and these actually have excellent parallels on the island of Chios. So this example in the bottom right is actually in the Chios Archaeological Museum, but the other three examples are from our shipwreck. We have one-handled bowls in various sizes, small and large. We also have table amphoras, presumably for serving wine at a symposium, perhaps. And these also exist in multiple sizes. So one of the things we've been trying to do is to determine if there was a base volumetric unit common to all of the table amphoras in our assemblage, and that has not appeared clearly as of yet, but we're working on it. We're going to exhaust our resources there. Interesting, though, that of the artifacts I just showed you, a very interesting assemblage of similar artifacts was excavated by the British at Emporio on the island of Chios in the 1950s. So these three artifacts were actually all found together with a Chian amphora in a single grave on the island of Chios. So here again, we have good evidence for close cultural and also ceramic affinities between Chios on the one hand and the Piraea, the Chian Piraea, the mainland where Erythrae is located on the other hand. So that's a quick look at some of the fine wares. We also found a number of cooking wares, including these kytrai and lopades. We do not have the brazier or small fireplace or heating element that is sometimes found. This example in the drawing actually comes from the Athenian agora, but we have a number of such cooking pots from the shipwreck. And in one example, we noticed that the bottom of the chytra or cooking pot was actually charred. And at the time we were in touch with Kurt Beck, who ran the Amber Research Laboratory at Vassar College. And so on the day off, we go into town, and I remember writing to Kurt Beck and saying, we have what looks like a charred substance on the bottom of this cooking pot. What should I do with it? And he said, oh, by all means, you should sample it and send it to me. So dutifully, I sampled it. We sent it off to him, and we waited and waited to learn, what he might be able to determine about this charred substance on the bottom of our cooking pot. And finally, on another day off, I went back and checked email, and there was a message from Kurt Beck, and he said, well, I can tell you whoever burnt the dinner did a very thorough job, because the sample you sent me is 100% pure carbon. So objects within the Tektaş Burnu ship include examples of attic black glaze pottery. And the question always comes down to whether or not these were galley wares or part of the cargo. I am inclined to see them as galley wares because, as you see here, they appear as singletons. There are really no two identical examples of any of these pieces. We have two cantharoi in the back, the one on the right, the sessile type, which is again fairly closely datable to the 3rd quarter of the 5th century BC. There's a small ascos you see there in the foreground, and then on the right, a small salt cellar, which actually has an eta graffito on the bottom, which again probably suggests, doesn't have to, but may suggest that this was a piece of someone's personal kit. Then let's talk a little bit about what we can say about personal possessions or shipboard items belonging to the crew. Early on in the excavation, we found these two square tiles made of bone. And it was actually Dr. Bass who said, I think these must be gaming pieces. We also found this lovely turned alabastron, which is essentially a perfume vessel. And one, probably an example of the Egyptian exotica that appear with some regularity in Ionia at this time. And then a few summers ago, while I was going through boxes of ballast stones, I began pulling out these small pebbles. And in setting them all aside, I realized fairly quickly that these were all found in the first season of excavation, and almost all of them came from the same grid square, the same part of the shipwreck. And they were so perfectly flat and round and slightly different colors. I thought there's no way these are ballast, because ballast should be at the bottom of the ship, and you shouldn't find little tiny pebbles in the first season of excavation when you're working on the top of the ship. So I think these are actually gaming pieces, perhaps part of a game that that also incorporated or relied on the two bone gaming tiles. And of course, we don't have to look too far to remember that checkers or such board games were common, certainly on ships. We see here the famous red figure vase by Exekias showing Achilles and Ajax playing such a game. I mentioned earlier that that this shipwreck really, the excavation occurred while digital underwater photogrammetry was in its infancy. And I have to credit three members of our team, Jeremy Green, Sheila Matthews, and Tufan Turanla, who pioneered and really worked through and I think perfected the system that we used at the time. Now I know that many of you out there are proficient in Metashape and creating images that are perhaps quite a bit more sophisticated than this one. But this was pretty cutting edge at the time. And I just wanted to refer you to their publication in IJNA, which really detailed the problem solving, the process of working out the digital photogrammetry at Tektaş, Burnu, which in the end saved us a lot of time on the seabed. Of course, inevitably that creates more processing time on the ship or in camp topside. But the amount of time that one saves with digital technology has really, again, been breathtaking. So let me just take an opportunity to point out here two interesting and diagnostic artifacts from the shallower end of the wreck site, about 130 feet deep, 38, 39 meters. And you can see here the drawn two-dimensional site plan. There are those same artifacts up there in the top left at the shallower end of the wreck. Here is what they look like in the course of excavation. These are marble discs, about 8 inches in diameter, pierced through the center with a lead spike, and actually convex, ever so slightly convex on that surface, but flat on the underside. We had various different theories circulating in camp about what these things were. Some people thought they were, and actually to be fair, we found one in one season and then the second one the following season. So we didn't have both of them at the same time early on in the excavation. But some people thought, oh, we're looking at a part of an elaborate jar like a pyxis or part of a child's toy. But ultimately it was, I think, Jeremy Green and Troy Novak who figured out that these were in fact the ship's eyes that would have been affixed to the vessel on either side of the bow. And Troy published an article again in IJNA in 2001, making a report on these curious artifacts. These are, I think, still to date, the only eyes ever found in association with an ancient ship, although there are certainly other examples, particularly from the coast of Israel. And if we look at ancient vase paintings, again, which, you know, they're an important source of iconography for anyone interested in this period, here we see an oinakhui from the late 6th century BC, which clearly shows a ship under sail. And here at the bow, you can see this wonderful little circular eye, much like the eyes that we found on the Tektaş Burnu ship. But we also have images of warships, of course. So here you see galleys on a kylix from about the same period, 520 BC. And it's hard not to notice that many of these depictions also show a more naturally shaped, sort of almond-shaped eye on the bow screen where the bow lookout would have been positioned. And in fact, we have archaeological examples of these as well from excavations at the Piraeus near Athens in the 19th century. Those are the ship sheds, and the excavations there by Germans and Greeks uncovered a cache of such marble eyes. Those eyes were painted, we think, as were the Tektaş Burnu eyes. There is some evidence for the staining of some former pigment. And I was particularly intrigued when John Camp, director of excavations at the Athenian Agora, let me know that there were actually fragmentary eyes found in the Athenian Agora, which I would not have expected or anticipated. So he invited me to have a look at those eyes, and that resulted in an article in Hesperia. But I had so much fun working on that project because it's one of those situations when you start looking for something, then you see it everywhere. And so you can see here the apotropaic, the protective eye, which shows up on cups and coins and shields and even in mosaics. And I think this is not all that far away from the evil eyes, of course, that we see all over the Mediterranean, in Turkey, and on boats in Malta, the Mavi Boncuk. So that's a wonderful sort of cultural connection. Back to the Tektaş ship, though, we did find the remains of 5 anchors associated with the ship, and all that we really found were the lead cores of the anchor stocks. The wood was in most cases gone. There were some small fragments of wood still attached to one of these lead cores, but you see here 2 lead cores that again represent the remains of the wooden anchor stock. We also had examples of different anchors, same technology, but anchors actually with 4 cores. And so you can see here at least 3. There's 1, 2, 3, and there's a 4th one right back there, being excavated by Ken Trethaway, who published, again, a preliminary report on those lead anchor stock cores in IJ&A, with the same issue actually as Troy's article on the ophthalmoi. Now, when it comes to the ship's hull remains, I would just encourage you to think back to the slide that I showed you early on, showing the topography of the coastline at Tektaş Burnu and those jagged spires of rock. We had very little left, sadly, in the way of hull remains. But what we did have has been is still being researched and was published by Wendy van Duivenvoorde in IJ&A in 2014. So here you can see really all that we have to suggest that this ship was built using pegged mortise and tenon joinery. These are fragments of oak tenons, and you can see here the hole for the peg. And Wendy's reconstruction of the original size of these tenons. We also had many nails, about 200 double clenched copper nails, and very few fragments of the framing. Most of what survived was very worm-eaten, consumed by teredo worms. And you see here the remains of what is basically a made frame. So it's interesting because the ship falls in a very important time period between, of course, laced construction and the fully fledged pegged mortise and tenon joinery with full frames and alternating full frames and futtocks, or floors and futtocks and alternating half frames that we see at Kyrenia. And Wendy actually does an excellent job describing or explaining this in her article. But she was basically able to use those double clenched copper nails and the effort that we put into mapping them on the seabed to lay out a plan or a space for our ship. And by mapping those nail concretions on the seabed, she was able to deduce that we're dealing with a ship probably about 14 meters long, even though sadly very little of the ship itself survives. So I guess I will conclude then so that we have a little bit of time for questions. I hope we do. You know, I just wanted to say that what we learned from the Tektaş Burnu ship is that the archaeological record of classical Ionia, even though it is riddled with holes, shipwreck archaeology, I think, can help fill in some of those gaps. It can answer some of the questions raised by terrestrial archaeology. And I think in this case, we're really shedding important light on the economic condition of Ionian erythrae during a period when so much of our information comes from Athens and concerns Athens and not Ionia. So with that, I will just say thank you for joining us today, and I'm happy to take any questions we may have time for.
Well, with that, I think I also have to thank Dr. Carlson for her time, her interest, as well as engaging all of us in this very interesting presentation. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much. Now, I recognize even if all 200 people applaud, it's unfortunate we can't be here in person and all share in that. But this is now an opportunity, as you say, to start asking questions and start engaging our curiosity. Now, because we have such a large audience, which is really, really gratifying, it will be easier if you write your questions within the chat function, and then I will do my best to convey those to Dr. Carlson, or I'm sure she can see them as well. Because with 200 people starting to talk, I won't be able to see all of you if you raise your hand. So please write your question in the chat. Now, with that in mind, there are a number of good questions there already. The first one that came up is actually regarding the coin itself from erythrae. Someone is asking about the images on the coin and what they mean. Can you go back to that slide?
Yes, let me do that. I could probably do it more efficiently than this, but we are in fact recording this lecture too, so
Yes.
we'll be able to post that online. Sorry, if I were a little more proficient.
That's all right.
With PowerPoint and Zoom and integrating the two, that might have not been so clumsy. So yeah, the iconography of Erythraean coins, not my expertise, but I believe most of the Erythraean coins feature the head of Heracles on the obverse. And then on the reverse, we typically see the club of Heracles that's here, and a quiver, sometimes with bows in the quiver. And then the Greek text, I believe, often names a magistrate, archon, maybe the minting magistrate. And then I guess on this example here, you have what looks to be an owl or some kind of bird. But the ERY, the epsilon rho upsilon, is definitely a consistent feature, as is the club of Heracles and the bow in a quiver, which you see there. I think maybe even a little better than the first example.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Now, just to point out to everyone in our audience, if I am unable, if I don't properly associate your name with the question, that's entirely my fault. That is just a, how can I say, that's a mistake on my part. So please don't take it personally. Now, the next question is actually regarding the two amphorae from Mende. And this was something that had never occurred to me. I even remember when these were recovered and when they were in the Institute in Bodrum. And it's actually a great question. They have the pine tar and the beef ribs inside, but the mouths seem particularly small to get the stuff out. So what do you think the plan was to remove the ribs from the beef or the pine tar?
Yeah, we were able to do it. I mean, there were still some beef ribs inside. Now, obviously, they were the bones without the meat on them. So it's a good question. The pine tar actually is fairly viscous, and on one occasion, at least in storage in the Bodrum Museum, when the temperatures soared, as they tend to do in Bodrum in the summer, the pine tar actually reliquefied. So that I think would not have been difficult to extract from the amphora. The beef ribs, I suppose it's possible that the jar would have to have been broken to get them out, although someone with small wrists, I think, could have fished around and retrieved, one or two or three a meal. And that really kind of begs the question, were these being transported as cargo, or are they victuals? Are they for the crew, provisions for the crew? The fact that the two amphoras, and I'm not sure I explained this very well, but the two amphoras that contained beef, one is a Mendian jar and the other is actually a Pseudo-Samian jar, but it's bigger than I think all the other Pseudo-Samian jars. So they're clearly choosing these jars specifically. And I think in the case of the Pseudo-Samian amphora, the mouth in particular, the neck and the mouth is bigger than other examples from the site. So that maybe that suggests that they intended to be able to get at them in the course of the voyage and actually consume them on board.
That's a good point. And I think Deborah Donnelly somewhere else, she suggested that perhaps the material would be reheated inside the amphora just to simply get the pitch out as well.
I think that's a possibility. William Murray was on our team and has been researching and working on the value of what were 10 Mendian amphoras full of pine tar worth, because pine tar could be used in so many different capacities or applications. So I think this is not an insignificant consignment within our cargo.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I hadn't considered that either. Now we have another question here from owner Ozturk, and he is asking about the two square bone tiles that George suggested could be gaming pieces. And his suggestion is that could they be inlaid parts of a gaming board, much more similar to, say, a checkerboard or a chessboard?
That is very interesting. Onurbe, I had not actually considered that. In reading up about ancient board games, I'm reminded of one that the components of which were basic tiles, and then there were kings, and there were two, or there were pieces identified as particularly valuable. So in my mind, I was thinking that if these are part of the same set, that the bone tiles might represent those high value gaming pieces. I had not considered the idea of inlay, and I think I don't know if there are examples of such inlaid boards. I suspect there must be from places like Egypt. But I'm grateful for the question, and I think it's interesting. I'm not too sure how we'd the edges tend to be finished.
Really?
Although that's hard to say whether that's just wear. I mean, I suppose there should be some microscopic analyses we could do that might help us answer that question. It's a very interesting suggestion, though. I thank you for it.
Yeah, I like that as well. And I mean, it would suggest then that the actual gaming board itself would be almost a luxury item.
There's certainly not much of luxury on this ship.
And if I may, I know the time period is off, but it looked very much like the Egyptian game boards we have at the Metropolitan Museum. So I wonder, if that tradition continued all the way to that time period. Of course, that would be a stretch. So I'm wildly guessing there, but they look fascinating.
May I ask, what are the other tiles on the game board? Are they all, I mean, these are bone. Are they wood? Are they?
I am gonna post a link from the Metropolitan Museum's Egyptian ones, but those are roughly 1,000 years older. So I don't know if the tradition continued. So Dr. Carlson, it's a wild guess, but There may be similar techniques, but the pieces look very pretty. So that was one of the things that came to my mind. But thank you for answering my question.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, the next question is from Alan Campbell, who, as you might recall, was actually diving on the site in 2000. And he mentioned bringing up an amphora with a lambda inscribed on the neck.
That, Alan, yes. In fact, it was not a lambda. I believe it looked like that at the time. It was, in fact, a sort of a vestigial stamp of this type, the leaf type. So I think what we were seeing was just the very top. It was poorly applied, I should say. It wasn't very firmly pressed into the clay. So what was left was just sort of the crown of that diamond shape.
Okay, okay.
That's what I'm remembering, but I'll double check that.
I mean, that actually brings up a question I have, is that you've made the very important point that these stamps and such were added when the clay was still wet, basically before the material was fired. So why is that particularly important as opposed to adding the stamp after they were fired?
Well, it's important because it's a totally different part of the process, right?
Mm-hmm.
And anyone who's thrown pots know that you lose certain vessels in the kiln, in the firing process. There's an attrition rate. Mm-hmm. So in effort to connect stamping to things like taxation, becomes really complicated and uncertain when you're looking at stamps that were applied to these jars before they ever went into the kiln, before they were lined, before they were filled, before they were put on a ship, before they were taken off a ship and then delivered or sold in a marketplace or an agora. So there's a distance, honestly, in that process that really probably suggests the stamps are more closely tied to production in a workshop, on a farm, on an estate, than they are necessarily tied, at least at this stage, to some authoritative taxation process. Okay. And then of course we have graffiti, which are like completely the opposite end of the spectrum, right? Because those are the graffiti are being applied, tally marks, letters, etc., as the vessels are probably coming on and off ships or being delivered or inventoried. So they're really at almost at opposite ends of the production and use spectrum.
Okay. So, I mean, what's wonderful about the site is that you're able to generate this nice, rather close dating of the material. But did you do any carbon-14 dating with the oak as well?
We have done, we've submitted, I'm trying to think now, I should have had this figure at the ready, but we have probably a dozen radiocarbon dates from wood, but also even from grape seeds found within the amphoras. And we never get a tighter date than, 50 or 60 years. So really? The amphoras really, and the ceramics, in this case at least, are providing a narrower date than I think radiocarbon can. Although I'm not an expert, so if there are people out there who have other suggestions, I'm certainly open.
And my impression is that the wood was not, how can I say, robust enough to do any sort of dendrochronological data.
Absolutely not. And I decided to leave out, I mean, I know what you're used to looking at, Matthew, in terms of, hull remains from Bosbrun and other ships. I mean, I left out the photos of the really worm-eaten. It's hard to look at, but there's very little, it looks like Swiss cheese. Okay, I understand. And then Deborah Donnelly has another question. She's actually asking if there's other material from Egypt that was found on site. Wow, great question. No, off the top of my head, no, not really. And I guess, Deborah, you're thinking of the alabastron, which is something of a singleton, a unique find on this ship in this assemblage. I actually had someone in another lecture ask me if it's possible that there was a woman on board because of the alabastron, which quite frankly, I'm embarrassed to admit I'd never even considered. But I think this is, some sort of personal possession, perhaps even a gift, because alabastra are traditionally associated with women and toiletry items. But no, I'm not really all of the artifacts in this assemblage really can be tied pretty closely to Ionia and to the Chian Peria around Erythrae and Chios.
Okay. So would it have been possible to do any sort of, I don't know, residue analysis inside of it?
Yeah, we didn't see anything that would suggest that there was something actually contained inside, but I have not pursued that, and I suppose that's something we certainly could do in the future.
We're giving you quite a list, aren't we?
Well, this is, this is partly why research like this goes on for decades, and it's wonderful. I mean, I consider myself very lucky to be in this position. But I included deliberately the references to the articles in the PowerPoint because I want people to know the work is moving forward on this and where they can go to find publications on various topics related to this shipwreck.
Mm-hmm. In fact, related to that, we have a question from Mutlu Günay, who was actually part of your team as well. He's curious about the current state of the conservation of the material.
Well, it goes on. It is largely finished. And one of the challenges more recently has simply been the renovation of the Bodrum Museum, because all of these artifacts are in the Bodrum Museum. So when that renovation started, things were being moved sort of constantly and in storage and accessible and not accessible. So for the last few years, we've only really been able to get at things in small batches or in discrete groups. But there is a new exhibit now featuring the Tektaş Burnu material in the Bodrum Museum. So I hope folks will go check that out when you're next in Bodrum. Okay.
Yeah, I want to see it as well. So, I mean, you had the opportunity to work there for 3 seasons. With all of that, was the rocks, was the geology, was that the biggest difficulty you encountered? This is actually a question from Julian Fernandini. Like, what was the biggest problem you found there?
A great question. Twofold, I would say the sea conditions were occasionally hazardous. And, for me, that's a poignant reminder that ships in the ancient world didn't always sink in lake-like conditions. I mean, they tended to be wrecked in places where there were strong winds and treacherous seas and things were not predictable. We certainly encountered that at Tektaş Burnu more than once. We then went on to excavate another ship sort of around the corner at Kızılburun, where the sea conditions were even more complicated. So yeah, sea conditions and just getting everyone safely in and out of the water every day was sometimes challenging. And then honestly, I don't know if Robin Piercy's here, but he was a member of our team. And in the course of one dive on the bottom, he suffered a pretty nasty bite on his foot, because we dive without fins. When we're excavating on site, we take our fins off so that we don't disturb small artifacts. But he was working away and his foot was sort of above the cloud of sand and silt that's generated in the course of excavation. And here came a moray eel that saw his foot sort of flopping around like a fish and latched right onto it and figured out pretty quick it wasn't a fish. But anyway, Robin was okay. He actually finished the dive and then went on to the decompression stop. But yeah, so marine life was an occasional hazard.
Wow, I didn't know that. I'll have to ask him about that.
I have a great photo actually of Robin with his foot in the foreground, and it looks like somebody took a red Sharpie and just drew a dotted line around his foot because the teeth of the moray latched onto him.
Yeah, we can laugh at it now, but
yeah, he wasn't laughing then, but it will be in the final publication, that photo.
Well, from Andrew Goldman then, do you have any ideas about where the ship may have been going? What kind of trade was this? Was it local, regional?
Wow, yeah, good question. I mean, this looks on the face of it to be largely a local vessel plying I think a local or regional route. These amphora types, though, show up all over the Aegean, even into the Black Sea, and some of the parallels for those table amphoras that I showed you, quite a number of those parallels also come from the Black Sea, and there are some also on the island of Rhodes. But the pottery really looks to be largely of local manufacture.
Mhm.
And so I think the ship had probably just left Erythrae and was heading southward, but I'm not sure I'm comfortable speculating on where it might have been going.
Yeah, that's always a very tricky question because, I mean, particularly in the Aegean, I mean, you could make some sort of regional or quote unquote international voyage just by traveling across the sea, going from island to island. So
You
it's,
know,
yeah,
the ship that we excavated after Tektaş Burnu that I mentioned a moment ago at Kızılbrunn, which was carrying a Doric column in its components, that one, I think we can say with some certainty, was headed to the Temple of Apollo at Claros. But it's very unusual to have any real confidence about where a ship was going. It's very unusual. So it's a good question, but it's a very difficult one to answer.
well, here's another one from Bidur Tekok. She is asking about your pseudo-Samian stamps, and she is curious if the series relates to Erythrae production or to an offshoot possibly in Chios. Could be other production sites. And she's curious if there's been any archaeometric analysis of the material.
Wow. Right. Yeah. So I think Bilur knows that the geology of Chios and Erythrae is such that they're very similar, and in some cases difficult to distinguish through things like neutron activation analysis. We did send off a number of samples to Michael Kirshner for analysis, and this was years ago, I'm embarrassed to admit, for analysis in an effort to really try to fine tune the chemistry of those samples. And they were inconclusive. I mean, he could not tie them clearly to an existing pottery group. So that's what I can say, at least about the current state of the archaeometry, although I'd be interested certainly in pursuing more of that. And then the other question was about the stamps. Oh, production on Chios. Suppose it's possible. I hadn't really thought about it, I guess. I don't know. I'm not sure why a workshop on Chios would necessarily be stamping jars with the ERY ethnic. To me, that suggests, in the context of a civic stamp, it suggests that this is a civic local type, that the people of Erythrae would be the most likely to use their own emblem. But I'd love to know more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, it sounds like many questions in archaeology in which we have lots of good questions, but as always, we just need more data to try and answer them.
That it.
There it is from Gary Leiser. He's curious if the petals could be part of an abacus.
Well, they're not pierced, for one thing.
Yeah.
So I doubt it, right? I mean, they'd have to be perforated in the middle, I think, for that to be true. Interesting idea. But I think, in conjunction with the bone tiles, that maybe the gaming pieces, at least for me, makes the most sense at present. But it's an interesting idea, nonetheless.
Yeah, it is. It could have been used for some other sort of counting device for all we know. No, it's interesting. Now, you mentioned very bravely that you're not an epigrapher, but Nathan Helfman has a question about it anyway. And he noticed that there was a very consistent font for all of the letters used in the inscription. And he's curious if there was some sort of printing tool that may have been used to create the tribute list or for the, there it is, the regulations for erythrai. Do you think they were handmade? Do you have any ideas?
Well, I think the inscription was done by hand. Is that the question?
Well, he's curious if it was, if like the letters themselves, like a die was made, because they're so consistent.
I think that my understanding is that's the beauty of Greek epigraphy, Greek inscriptions, and is that they are, I mean, they're all done by hand, but they are incredibly precise.
Yeah.
And very legible.
Yeah.
Ironically, as I understand it, this stone is lost.
Oh, really?
There are fragments of it, and they were, I believe, in the British Museum. But in reading Meggs and Lewis, they refer to the stone as lost. So I'm not sure if that's this stone or if there was a larger stone, and then this we have. These fragments come from Athens or from Attica. So this is this was a copy, basically, that was, or a second version that was set up in Athens. But no, I'm not an expert in Greek inscriptions, but I've seen enough to know that these are fairly typical. So yeah, if you know Greek, reading Greek inscriptions, I think may in fact be easier than reading Roman Latin inscriptions, which were so abbreviated.
Yeah. So
I think some folks may want to sign off by now. I'm not sure, or maybe they already have. So I'm happy to stick around. I just don't want people to feel like, you know, they
well, we're still getting a few more questions coming in, as well as some very interesting people remembering and reminiscing about their time working on the site. So Omar Bakirer is asking if you found any glass on site. You found other elements that could be semi-luxurious personal items?
None.
Nothing.
None. Yeah,
Oh,
good question.
okay.
And the answer is none.
And then from, there's actually a good question about the wrecking process. You mentioned how the wrecks, unfortunately, often find these wrecks in rather bad situations. So, I'm sorry, I won't be able to pronounce your name, but we have a question if INA has often finding wrecks within this kind of environment, in these cliffside dangerous places. I mean, how often are you working on a cliff like this and building your houses?
Right. Yeah, I would say, you know, the first, what, I mean, yeah, this is, I guess, really sort of part of the INA legacy, to establish yourself as close to the wreck as possible.
Yeah.
And spend as much time as you can there. I mean, it's also a safety issue because we don't want people who have been decompression diving, you know, wandering away into town when they might, you know, show some signs of whatever, decompression sickness, et cetera. So it's obviously ideal to keep the team together. But yeah, I mean, I think this is true, not just in Turkey and with INA projects, but in many places around the Mediterranean, certainly in France, where you tend to find multiple wrecks, you know, sort of superimposed on one on top of the other. Yeah, I think just the reality is that ships sank in difficult conditions, and those conditions continue today.
Yeah.
We do know, I should say, that Wendy also in her IJNA article talks about this, as I have talked about it, I guess, in some of my publications. But we did find the remains of one 4-cord anchor at the base of the cliff on which our wreck was situated. So it was perched on this kind of cliff, an outcropping, and then that dropped off to, I don't know, about 180 feet, maybe 190 feet. And we surveyed around the bottom of that cliff and found an anchor, which suggests to me that that anchor was probably cast out before the ship sank, before the ship came to grief, in an effort to keep it off the rocks.
Okay.
And I can't say what happened, but obviously the anchor didn't hold and the ship sank.
Yeah. I mean, another thing to consider regarding this question about finding the ships next to these awful steep cliffs is that, in my experience, places that are very wonderful and comfortable to dive in often mean that there have been sport divers there, and there have been people who may have been looting material underwater. So in a way, as archaeologists, we're benefiting not only from these unfortunate disasters, we're also benefiting from the fact that it's very difficult to get to these places under normal circumstances. So that's another thing to consider when we're looking at the preservation of these sites and how to get to them. There's
Absolutely.
another good question. There it is. This is the one that everyone is nervous about, from Susanna Snowden Smith. What's the plans for the final publication?
It's a work in progress, and
Yeah.
we continue to inch away at it, chip away at it. I mentioned earlier that there's so many people now working with Metashape, and this is the thing. If you wait around long enough, then the technology advances to the point that you have to take the leap and process your data in the latest, greatest, newest format. So we have been, turning out articles here and there in bits and pieces, but the final publication in 7 or 8 chapters is underway. It will appear, I can't say when, but when it appears, it will be in the Nautical Archaeology series of Texas A&M University Press. And chapter 1 is co-authored by Dr. Bass and myself. And I'm very grateful to have that in place and finished since we lost him last year.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm looking forward to seeing it as well. Now we have 2 more questions, unless others pop up. One question is from Dan. He's asking if the ballast stones could shed any light on where the ship may have started this journey. And then from Michael, he's curious if the bone tiles were actually distinctly different colors.
Yeah, on the subject of ballast, Dan, it's a good one, because ballast, I think, is one of the least, it's the most underestimated or least valued element in shipwrecks. There's a lot more we could be doing with ballast. I did examine some of the ballast in the company of a geologist, and those analyses are ongoing. The trick is, of course, in identifying what was ballast and what was just local seabed, and so a lot of, there are cobbles, river cobbles, but there are not many of them, really not. I would say fewer than 20. And then there's a lot of stuff that looks a lot like local stone, the white and sort of reddish, very sharp and angular, not smooth like ballast. So I don't think we have necessarily as much actual ballast as we did during the excavation. I think some of what came up is probably not ballast. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things I'm working on weeding out. But if I'm faced with so many other tasks that one is not gotten a lot of attention. So if you have suggestions or ideas, I'd be very grateful to hear them about what sorts of things I might be pursuing in terms of analyses.
If anyone would like to volunteer to sift through the ballast, in fact.
It won't take long.
Yeah.
It's more a question of what I do with it, or what gets done with it after that.
And Debbie's actually right. It can be a much more diagnostic thing than it may appear. So for example, on the shipwreck excavated near Kyrenia from the 4th century BC, they were sifting through the ballast material from that site, and they actually found stone tools within the ballast material, which lent this whole new element to working on the material itself. So obviously the tools were found where the ballast was found. It was not something belonging to the crew. but it can just reveal that there's a great deal of depth and complexity to this material.
And you know, Matthew, that's such a good point, because I'm reminded in looking at today's talk and reviewing images of the wreck, I'm reminded that we were finding artifacts in holes, in pockets that were concealed. I myself excavated a table amphora and a couple other artifacts from, it was like a pit of rock, and I had to literally extract chunks of rock that had overgrown, and there were artifacts in there. So this slide, I think, is particularly revealing, because I think, you know, a lot of the seabed looked like that, and so there's the opportunity for small things and even not so small artifacts to fall into those gaps was always present.
Yeah.
It's why these projects take 3, 4, 5, 10 years.
Yeah, it's a very complex site. Well, I think we've run out of questions, but we certainly have not run out of audience members, which is always very good to see. So before I go, I want to let everybody know, first of all, I want to thank all of you for participating and joining with us today. I greatly appreciate that. I also want to thank Tuba and Elif for helping to organize this, Dr. Carlson for her time and this very interesting presentation. And lastly, I want to say that this will not be the only collaborative public seminar that we will be offering. We are tentatively scheduling Alcibiades Ginalis, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the German Archaeological Institute here in Istanbul. And he will be giving a presentation in March or April about his research on Roman and late antique era harbors within the Aegean. So just like this lecture, we will be sending out more email messages. We will be establishing a Zoom link. And again, I hope to all see you there. Now, once again, before we go, I want to thank Dr. Carlson, and I want to thank all of you. So have a good day, stay safe, be careful, and good day, good evening, and good night.